Well, hello and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. We are the Climate and Green Energy Group of the Harvard Club of the UK. And this is actually our second ever event. The first event was a couple of months ago, a couple of weeks ago, shortly after we were founded as a group. So we're very excited in 2021 and hopeful that we'll be able to get together as a group in person. But because obviously it would be nice to meet everybody and really do some in-person networking. But in the meantime, we felt it was important to get this group started because some of the topics that we're going to be discussing around climate and green energy have a lot of urgency to them. So our first event was actually about greenwashing, and we were very lucky to be joined by a couple of distinguished guests from CDP and Influence Map. And if you missed that session, we will be sharing that recording shortly. For today's session, please do feel free to use the chat feature on Zoom. We'd love to hear your comments and get your questions. We do want to make this as interactive as possible. And it's a very unique opportunity here to get people with so many different perspectives, so much different expertise. So we'd love for this to become a forum where people can exchange ideas and instigate action. So once again, thank you very much for joining. And I'm going to hand over to Sylvia to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. At our second event, we're going to explore whether the COVID-19 pandemic could become a green swan, or to put it more accurately, whether it could create numerous green swans. But what is exactly a green swan? To better understand this term, it is worth understanding its origin. You're likely to have heard people instead referring to the current pandemic as a black swan, a term now widely used that was originally coined by a scholar, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, to describe an unpredictable, rare, catastrophic event. The term was developed to explain the disproportionate role of such a high-profile, hard-to-predict event that are events that are beyond the realm of normal expectations. But the pandemic was wholly predictable. Bill Gates, Laurie Garrett, and Nassim Taleb himself are amongst the individuals that foresaw it. Unfortunately, for many of us, including policymakers and businesses, the prospect of a pandemic was something we didn't see coming, or I would say we chose to turn a blind eye to. So if a black swan is the rare catastrophic event, a green swan, as described by our esteemed speaker, John Elkington, is just as significant an event, but one that leads to exponential progress in the form of economic, social, and environmental wealth creation, like a phoenix rising from the ashes of a black swan, as John explains. So as we enter the Anthropocene epoch, that is the time where us humans are the driving force behind planetary change, it is worth considering whether the COVID-19 pandemic could be the trigger for fundamental change. The pandemic alone might not be a black or a green swan, but the opportunities that lie ahead could create an enormous, unprecedented shift towards a more prosperous and sustainable economic system. But perhaps I'm confusing you with all these references to birds. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our distinguished speaker. John Elkington is a world authority on corporate responsibility and sustainable capitalism, as well as a best-selling author and a serial entrepreneur. He's dubbed the godfather of the global sustainability movement. He coined the regularly used term triple bottom line, and currently is the founding partner and chief pollinator at Volans, a company helping businesses drive positive change. John has won numerous awards and is the author of over 20 books. His latest book, Green Swan, is a manifesto for system change designed to serve people, the planet, and foster prosperity. We urge every one of you to buy the book. We actually offer a discount price. Joe and I have read the book, and I personally finished the book, although it's not very lengthy, but it takes a bit of time. But I finished it within like 4 days. So we'll encourage you to read this amazing book. It gives me great pleasure to ask John to share his initial thoughts and some of his research on the topic. Joe and I will then ask John some questions, and our intention is to spend the last 15 to 20 minutes until 5:15 UK time for a Q&A session. So please use the Q&A chat room you see at the bottom of your Zoom screen to share all your questions along the way, starting from now. Erica Susanto from our group, she will then gather all your questions and we'll try to answer as many as possible considering the time limitations. John.
Sylvia, thank you hugely. Can I just check that you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
You can hear good, because it's, you know, sometimes you launch in and people can't hear you properly. So good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes and I'll use some slides while I do that. And then I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. And thanks, Joe, very much indeed for setting us up. Hopefully, can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. In that case, we're good to go. So I'll pick up on some of the things that have already been said, but hopefully extend the agenda a little bit further as well. I'm going to talk about green swans, and I'll explain what those are in a little bit more detail. But they're basically about trajectories or trends that take us exponentially, at least potentially, in directions that we do want to travel rather than those that we don't want to travel in. And just a few words on my current organization, which we set up in 2008, right in the teeth of the 2007-2009 sort of financial crash. The parent organizations were Sustainability, which I co-founded in 1987, and the World Economic Forum and the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship. Valens was the first B Corporation in the United Kingdom. When we can get in there, we're based in Somerset House, and we have a range of different clients and partners around the world. And I'll touch on a little bit of the relevant work in a moment. But just before I start properly, one of the questions I've been asked routinely for decades is, you know, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And as you'll probably see, I'm some mix of the two. I actually think there's no question that we have dark clouds on many of our horizons at the moment. But on the other hand, as I'll try and explain, it's in times like those when change can go off the scale. And I think the opportunity to change the wider economic, social system now is greater perhaps than it ever has been. So just the first few words on who I am, how I came to this, and what sort of discount factor you can apply to what I might say. So I'm a baby boomer. I'm 71. I've co-founded 4 companies since 1978. They all still exist. That has a lot more to do with other people than me, and I mean that. And I've served on now 80 boards or advisory boards in different parts of the world, from very large companies like Nestle down to very small social enterprises, venture capital funds, and so on. And as Sylvia kindly said, the Green Swan book has just come out in April, published by Fast Company Press. Now, the subtitle, The Coming Boom in Regenerative Capitalism, I think probably struck quite a number of people as delusional, slightly crazy, all of those sort of good words, until probably in September, the CEO, shown here, Doug McMillon, of Walmart, so the world's largest retail group, committed his company to becoming a regenerative business. Extraordinary. I mean, I have no particular brief for Walmart. In fact, many of their activities over the years and the consequences I haven't liked at all. But when a company on that scale makes that sort of commitment, not only does it have a consequence for the company itself, but it cascades through the supply chain. So that word regenerative, the linked concept of regeneration, I think we'll be hearing a lot more of. And no accident in a way. If you look at the green poster here in the middle of this sequence, you'll see it's about moving from extractive or degenerative capitalism to regenerative forms of the same. And this series of posters and the full page ad shown on the left appeared first in the New York Times and also in the Financial Times, posted there by a group called Imperative 21, something like 300 organizations. Valence was one of them. And the message was relatively simple. It was that 50 years before, almost exactly, Milton Friedman had published his manifesto, in effect, through the New York Times, basically arguing that there was only one bottom line, and it was financial. Well, that's shaped business pretty much ever since, extremely powerfully. But I think a growing number of people, including a growing number of capitalists, are beginning to realize that this sort of approach has consequences. It has good consequences and it has bad consequences, many of them unintended. So I'm not going to run through all of the different themes flagged in the posters to the right, but what you see there is a range of non-financial, or perhaps I should call them pre-financial considerations, which companies are increasingly having to take into account. So I believe, and we started to say this last year, that the 2020s will be an exponential, perhaps the exponential decade. And I'll talk about that a little. So we're all familiar with these sorts of technology trajectories, adoption curves, and so on. And increasingly, they're just going vertical. They're, in relative timescales, these things are accelerating at an accelerating rate. And particularly as we increasingly see our economy going digital. At the same time, you've got people on the sustainable development side, that sort of non-financial form of value agenda side of the equation, talking about in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of those, and wonderful they are. But what most people and many companies have been, hundreds of companies have been signing up to these things, including most of the biggest companies in the world. They think this is an incremental change agenda. And that's one of the reasons why they feel able to sign up to it. But if you just look at the first two goals, no poverty and zero hunger by 2030, which is the deadline, those are super hyper exponential goals, and people just simply not understanding that as yet. They're actually system change goals. So I think that's something to bear in mind as we move towards that 2030 deadline. And there's a problem in all of this, and you all know it. And it's relatively simply stated, and it is this: that our human brains are very poorly configured to deal with exponential trends. We miss the underlying evidence of change coming through at an accelerating rate until it's too late, until the world all around us starts to change in quite unpredicted ways. Now, COVID-19 has been an extraordinary example of that. As Sylvia was saying, there were plenty of people who actually predicted it. Well, not just a pandemic, but a coronavirus pandemic. In my own country, the United Kingdom, still the United Kingdom, we'll see how long that lasts. You had a study done in 2016, which pretty much exactly happened, predicted what happened. And what did we do? We ignored it. In the United States, they even set up a White House unit to monitor and manage these sorts of things, but they shut it down before the pandemic hit. So we're not very good at this, but we're going to have to become a lot better. And for me, understanding black swans and green swans is a crucial element of that. So we've recently set up an observatory to track green swan market trajectories in different parts of the world, different sectors, addressing different challenges, different opportunities. One of the most obvious, and you will all have seen diagrams like this, is the profound acceleration in the potential and power of renewable energy technologies. This diagram shows the collapse really in solar power costs, but you can see the same trends in wind power. You can see the same trends in battery technology and so on. And what you see in the diagram is over the same period of the Sustainable Development Goals, renewable energy is going to become very, very dramatically cheaper, to the point where it's the electric power that's produced in this way is cheaper even than the power being produced by fossil power plants that have already been built. So that's one example. And if you look at what's going to happen over the next certainly 15 to 20 years, what you see is not a straight line trajectory. You actually see a system flip. And it's interesting. This is a diagram put together by a group based in London and Silicon Valley. They're called Rethink X. I really recommend their work. And they've looked at sectors like transportation and mobility. They've looked at cattle ranching and dairy farming, and now most recently they look at energy, and they see the same trends in each of those sectors, and they're starting now to look at the financial sector as well. And what you see is not just, as I say, that steady straight line trajectory. What you see is virtuous and vicious cycles, death spirals even, where various factors start to trip in which people hadn't expected or predicted. And you start to see that with the oil companies now having to, and before them the coal companies, having to declare growing amounts of stranded assets or potentially stranded assets. And at the moment, that's largely driven by COVID-19, but they're also waking up to the fact that the climate emergency will drive very similar trends. So I'm often asked the obvious question, so what is a green swan? So for me, it's not an extraordinary entrepreneur or CEO. It's not an extraordinary company or brand or whatever, although all of those may play into a green swan market trajectory. These are market shifts. They're profound changes in the way that we understand value, that we understand markets. And the example that I give is from the European Union, and it is the Green Deal that has recently come into effect across the EU. And the number associated with that last time I looked is something like 1.82 trillion euros. So that's not a small sum of money. In fact, it's a pretty sizable amount. And I do suspect the numbers put on EU and other major government programs, but this is a very big shift in the focus of investment across the European Union, and it's driving increasingly towards inclusive growth and green, clean growth. So this is paradigm shift is a term that's often misused and misunderstood, but I think this is potentially a paradigm shift. Towards the conclusion, one of the things that gives me most hope at the moment is younger people, by which I don't mean we should dump everything in younger people's laps and say, we're the baby boomers, we tried, we were environmentalists. Well, most boomers weren't. I mean, they drove sport utility vehicles if they were in the OECD world and so on and so forth. But I think this is a pan-generational project and set of challenges where we all have to increasingly work together. But I think what we've got to do is to accelerate change in the right direction, is pull younger people into decision-making sooner than would otherwise have happened. So in Spain, we're working with a company called Acciona. They're an infrastructure and renewable energy company. They are global in their operations. And we've pulled 27 of their fast-track young people from around the world into a program. And initially it was to try and develop a 5-year sustainability program for Acciona. And what it's evolved into, and it's been accepted by the very top of the company, is a 10-year strategy for the company as a whole, in which now sustainability is very much embedded. And this is a diagram that we developed about 18 months ago, and then since then have populated those sort of data points along the way, the three curves, working with a number of different companies, big ones, small ones, and one regulatory agency, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. And what we think we see is a profound shift. You'll notice there's no time scale at the bottom of this, but I think this is probably takes us through into the late 2030s, early 2040s. You see a period of our collective history, which pretty much tracks back to the Second World War. So the period that followed Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan and so on. And during that period, business pretty much thought it knew what it was doing. And increasingly over time, it was encouraged to be more responsible. So more transparent, more accountable, manage its supply chains in appropriate ways, engage external stakeholders, all of that good stuff. And core to that sort of reality were concepts like shareholder primacy, which is pretty much the Milton Friedman agenda, and GDP. And what we're beginning to see is a waning of that era, and I've already touched on that. And instead of that agenda focusing on growing responsibility, it doesn't mean that's replaced. In fact, that responsibility agenda continues to expand. If you just think about COVID-19, access to public health care, wealth divides, tax havens, all of these sorts of things are increasingly pushing into the responsibility agenda. But now if you listen to what politicians and many business leaders and many investors are talking about, they're talking about resilience. And the reason they're talking about that is because the systems that we have depended on for so long, our economies, our societies, our political systems, are wobbling. They're no longer necessarily going to be fit for purpose. And therefore we need to think about how do we make them more resilient? Well, the only way I know to do that is to invest in them over long periods of time, in effect, to regenerate them. And those are not just our economies and societies and political systems, that's also the biosphere, the natural environment. So what we're looking for is examples of not just green swan trajectories or of lame duck industries that are starting to sort of go into decline, although some of them may reverse that process of decline. We're looking for ugly ducklings. We're looking for examples of technologies, of business models, of policy packages, which will help us get onto some of those exponentially positive trajectories. I think it's going to be a very exciting period. So that was just some comments that I thought I'd share with you on the Green Swans agenda. And now I'm completely at your disposal. So I'll stop sharing.
John, thank you. Thank you. That was extremely interesting. I guess my first question is around the current situation, the pandemic. When it first started, many people were worried that green action, climate action would be left aside. But what we're seeing now, you mentioned EU's Green Deal, the 1.8 trillion, Walmart, and we've seen multiple examples where actually the pandemic has accelerated environmental plans rather than putting them on the back burner. Do we see any green swans getting out of the current situation? Could the vaccine response be one of them?
Well, several things, Sylvia. And the first one is that you mentioned Nassim Nicholas Taleb. And one of the things he's often said in recent months is he does not think this is a black swan, COVID-19. He thinks we saw it coming and therefore it doesn't qualify. And I should just say that when he talked about black swans, he was talking primarily about things that were taking us in directions we didn't want to go. But he also meant by black swans things that were completely unexpected and could potentially ultimately take us in good directions. I think COVID-19 has the potential to be a nest from which, an incubator from which a whole set of green swan trajectories spring forth in a way. And it's funny, earlier today I did a 3-hour session with the venture capital group in which a lot of their most successful companies were presenting. And then I went on to a session with Barclays looking at clean technology and startup businesses and so on. And across those two sessions, and many of the others I've been doing recently, the same theme keeps coming through, that we have hit some sort of inflection point. Because if we go back 15 or 20 years ago and if we had had something like COVID-19, and this process actually has only just started. I think the recessions that come from this will be pretty severe as well. Plus the challenges going alongside paying down the amount of capital that we've spent, invested, or squandered as a result of all of this. This is going to really check our ambitions for quite some time. And yet, we're seeing exactly as you say, people much more concerned about climate change, much more interested in green recovery packages, and this sense that the old order is failing in ways that we don't totally understand, but we need some other way of thinking about, some other way of planning for. So I think it can be an incubator, but I don't think that's automatic. Because you can have politicians, you can have political leaders like Boris Johnson who will declare, a 10-point plan and we're going to go green. It doesn't happen like that. Mariana Mazzucato, the economist, talks about the role of government, the state, in building the preconditions within which a space industry or whatever it happens to be can then evolve. And I think at the moment we've got this inflection point. We've got people waking up to it. We've got governments and CEOs starting to respond to it and acknowledge it. But we actually need sustained, strategic, effective action over not just months and years, but over decades and possibly even over generations. To my mind, that calls for a different form of government. And actually over time, I think it calls for different forms of democracy, where, for example, future generations might actually be formally represented.
Thank you, John. That's a lot of food for thought already. So thinking a little bit more about kind of the regulatory environment that could lead to the right conditions for green swans. As you said, we're seeing some leaders across different countries kind of step up and start to put frameworks in place, but not at the pace that we would hope for. Yeah. So what's your advice to kind of different communities, be they business communities, investment communities, etc., on how to work with government to encourage the right sort of regulation and do that proactively so that they can actually take a leadership role and minimize kind of the amount of poor investments that they may have to later write down?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that for decades now, people, activists, campaigners, NGOs, and so on, and I would include myself in that at times, have encouraged business and the financial markets to stay out of politics. In a sense, because and you had Influence Map in last time, and I think the work that they do is extraordinarily important, tracking what the private sector is doing to influence the public sector. And for much of the time, a lot of that was to push back some of the shifts that we needed in policy around environmental and social priorities. I think that's beginning to shift, and I think people are beginning to understand that the private sector has a really, really important role to play in encouraging governments to do the right thing, in informing what governments think and then enabling them to develop the technology and so on. I see in the chat function there was a point or a question made about the argument made was that so the cost of renewable energy plunged so much because we just simply outsourced production to China. Well, there's certainly an amount of truth in that, but I think we've actually gone through, that helped put us through a critical mass point where suddenly people understand that renewable energy is the direction, the future. Now, again, governments have a lot of, they have a really important role to play in all of that. And you look at the United Kingdom, for example, and wind power, we're saying we're now going to be, the wind power's equivalent to the Saudi Arabia. Well, if we ever get there, then it'll only be because the government sort of got in behind this. But now I think we've actually past one of those points where a whole series of virtuous cycles come in behind renewable energy, as that Rethink X diagram showed, and a whole series of really quite increasingly vicious cycles and dynamics get in behind the fossil fuels industry. Doesn't mean remotely that fossil fuels will disappear anytime soon, but they'll be on the back foot, they'll bleed talent, they'll bleed capital, and that's a really difficult place from which to embrace the future.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you, John. I guess this push that we see from shareholders, stakeholders, regulators, like for more green, like for stronger green frameworks, could that mean the death of the triple bottom line? Like, and what I mean by that is, companies now commit, like the term focuses on like the idea that companies should commit on social and environmental issues as much as they do on their profit. But could we see profit lagging behind, and like companies like Walmart, like you mentioned on your presentation, putting more effort on the social and environmental issues versus the profit, and at least in the short to medium term?
No, is the simple answer. And let me just very quickly explain to people who don't know about the triple bottom line. I mean, I came up with the idea in 1994, and the following year, 1995, I came up with the popularization, if that's what it was, of people, planet, and profit. But I always made it clear that for me, the triple bottom line was about economic, not just financial impact and value creation, alongside social and environmental. And as a few of you might know, in 2018, in June, through the Harvard Business Review, I launched what the HBR editors said was the first ever product recall, which is the way I styled it, of a management concept. And the product recall was of the triple bottom line. Now, it was largely with my tongue in my cheek, in the sense that you've now got tens of thousands of companies around the world producing sustainability or integrated or whatever they call them reports. And I spent decades trying to make that happen. You've now got something like 3,000 plus B corporations. These are companies that are chartered around the triple bottom line. And you've got increasingly quite large companies in there: Danone, Natura, 8 different subsidiary parts of Unilever, and so on and so forth. And I think we'll see more companies going in that direction. But the reason I recalled it was that I suspected what I was seeing was a mindset in many companies, which was about offsetting. It was about balancing acts. It was about, we're making a profit, and that's nice. And we're paying back our main stakeholders, our shareholders. We're having a good economic impact. There are economic multipliers in there. We're creating jobs, so tick on the social side, and we're sort of giving consumers what they want, and so on. So that's a tick as well. Shame about the environment. Or you could see the calculations running in different ways. Indeed, you could have a company or a business that met the social, ethical, environmental, and governance side perfectly well, but went bankrupt. So I was seeing these sorts of trade-offs, and I was worried about them, because the original intent of the triple bottom line was that we needed system change. We needed to change the way that economics operates and assesses value across those multiple different dimensions. So I don't think those multiple dimensions are going to go away. We may put other ones alongside them, but economic, social, environmental, and governance at the heart, and policy at the heart, and so on. And purpose at the heart. Now, another one of these recent areas of discussion. But I don't think it's going to go away. But it's simply, I was saying to people, just think when you're doing that offset process about what it would take to get you to an integrated approach, an integrated business model, where you created economic and social and environmental value all at the same time, because that's where I think we now have to go. And that is what I understand Doug McMillan at Walmart to be committing his company to. Now, whether he can deliver is another matter entirely. But I think, you know, psychologically, this is a critical moment, because there's such a huge and such. Well, one other thing is that also they're a company that is iconic to Trump's, President Trump, I should call him, his followers. I mean, Walmart is an absolutely iconic business in that geographical and political space. So I think this politically will be enormously helpful over time as well, but we'll see.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm going to pose you one more question. So, and then after that, we'll take questions from the audience. So everybody, please start typing in your questions and comments into the chat if you haven't already. Thank you so much for those who have. So kind of final question would be, you have sort of alluded to this point that we may require different political models and processes to actually generate the change that we need. Do you think that some level of climate-induced societal collapse is inevitable, or do you think we'll be able to manage a more orderly transition? And how can we lead towards that outcome?
Well, this takes me back to the pessimism versus optimism story, because you know, one of my favorite subjects when I was at school was history, and one of my favorite parts of history was economic history. And one of the things that I looked at were the periods where technology or new forms of value swarmed into the economy. And what very often, if not always, was the case was that you had a massive disruption. It could be the bubonic plague in Europe. It could have been the Second World War globally. You needed a major disruption in order to sort of kickstart the new order. And in fact, it's no accident, for example, that Germany and Japan did so well in the post-Second World War period, because we'd bombed them flat. And so they just had to start again. And now here we are, locked in by sort of 50 or 60 years of investment, which I think emphasizes the potential role of insurgent businesses way beyond those of the incumbent ones. The incumbents have got lazy. They've got to the point where they don't see what's coming at them. They can't see, in some ways, what's coming at them. Nonetheless, I think some of the big companies are starting to stir. They're starting to see that wider world. They're seeing digital competitors coming through. I mean, I worked with Bill Ford at Ford for a number of years in the early part of this century, and Tesla was this tiny nanodot out on the horizon. I was interested in them because I was interested in electric forms of transportation. But Ford sort of, and General Motors and others, they tried with electric cars, but it hadn't worked terribly well. So they pretty much dropped those. I mean, Ford sold off a company it bought from Norway called Think, which was electric vehicles, electric mobility. And then suddenly it's too late, because suddenly you know, now we have the major companies talking about 500 models of electric car or vehicle by 2023. This is just, it is an inflection point, because it's one of those moments where suddenly everything changes, including consumer expectations. One of the things that we were talking about at the venture capital session earlier on today. So I think we are at a point where things are going to change very rapidly. I don't think, to your question, it's going to be uniformly friendly to normal people. I think people are going to be shaking out of jobs. In a way, I think COVID-19, and people are increasingly saying this, is an acceleration of what was going to happen already. So some people this morning were saying it's actually, it's bounced forward stuff that was going to happen by about 5 years to date. Now, you know, we may find that slows down a bit when the true recession hits. And it may be that the recession doesn't hit in quite the way that I'm expecting it to. You know, China seems to be bouncing back, but my sense is it will. And I think it's the role of government to try and steer our societies and steer our economies through the rapids in order to ensure that it's the maximum good of the maximum number of people. because every time we go through one of these discontinuities, it's intensely painful, whether it's a depression, a war, or whatever it is, or the bubonic plague back in the day. I think we've got the possibility at the moment of turning COVID positive and moving very fast indeed. I just wish in the United States, for example, that the Biden-Harris administration had got a clearer margin to push forward some of the things that they know have to be done. And, you know, yeah, I'll stop there, but thank you for the question.
Yeah, I guess my last question would be, so do you think, based on what you just said, that zero hunger and no poverty by 2030 is possible? And I guess it's a recurrent theme of like regulators need to do more and they need to push more. Do we need like something like, I don't know, carbon tax that will help accelerate things? Or is it a little bit utopian to believe that within 9 years, we're not going to have poverty in the world?
I think it's utopian. It doesn't mean that utopian is a bad thing, but you have to be realistic as well. I don't think we'll have zero hunger by 2050. I don't think we'll have no poverty by 2050. But it's an aspiration. It's a sort of an ultra ambitious statement of a set of goals, which then people bend themselves towards. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, in the same way that Doug McMillan is committing his company to a set of goals that he doesn't properly understand and declares that he doesn't understand how that company will meet. But by expressing the ambition, you know, Steve Jobs used to know this, that you start to distort other people's sense of reality. Now, if you're a populist like Bolsonaro or Erdogan or whoever it might be, Boris Johnson at times, it's not necessarily a good thing doing that. But I think we're at one of those points where we need extraordinarily ambitious and extraordinarily effective leadership. And that's in all sectors. And I mean that, I think that we're seeing a huge challenge to the NGO world, because the patterns, the models that served NGOs so well in the past, you know, I think they have to reinvent themselves. And one of the things I say in the book is there are three major things that we have to reinvent now. The first is capitalism, the second is democracy, and the third is sustainability, which people might be slightly surprised by. They might think that that's automatically the future, but in a sense, it's evolved in a world and adapted to a world which has got to change beyond measure, and therefore I think it's not entirely yet fit for the future.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to pass over now to questions coming from our attendees. And the first one is from Andrew Black. And
Yep.
he's asking, says he's under the impression that the amount of green capital as part of the Global Recovery Programme was quite small, much less than we had initially hoped.
Yeah.
So he's asking if you could comment on that. Are things actually more positive than they appear to be?
They're positive, I think, psychologically. They're not positive in the sort of financial sense, and in the sense that you are right. I think the expectations have been that a huge amount of public treasure would sluice into the economy and drive us all towards, you know, refurbishment of buildings and all the good things that need to happen. And we see it every day in the United Kingdom, for example, commitments to green agriculture and all the rest of it. Well, lovely ambitions. We'll see whether that's possible. I think the worst thing that could happen would be through huge amounts of financing into the economy to drive inclusive and green goals. Because despite everyone's protestations, I don't think we yet collectively understand how we take an economy and then turn it, without going too utopian, into an economy that's properly inclusive and properly not only responsible and resilient, but over time regenerative across all of the different dimensions of value. And therefore, I think we need to sort of phase the capital as it comes into the economy. We have to do a period of experimentation and prototyping and abandonment where things clearly aren't going to work, despite people's hopes. And then we've got to put that capital in behind it's almost a venture capital approach. We've got to test and refine and then properly invest. And certain cultures, as we know, are good at doing that and scaling companies. You think about Amazon and Google and so on in the United States. Other cultures are not so good or singularly poor. And I think that's something we've got to address alongside. There's a culture of change which goes, I think, necessarily hand in hand with investment in change. And there will be unintended consequences. I mean, we're already seeing it with artificial intelligence and the surveillance society and issues around facial recognition and so on. And we're sort of stumbling backwards into those issues. Whereas if we had something like the old US Office for Technology Assessment, we'd be assessing those technologies now for the broad range of implications that they might have and beginning to address those through policy and other ways. At the moment, we're not doing that effectively.
I guess our next question is from HNS Matsuda from Japan,
Yeah.
who seems to be a bit worried because you mentioned solar power electricity price that will decrease significantly in the years to come. And Matsuda came out of a meeting this morning discussing investing billions in solar power, but was not expecting a further significant decrease in solar power's price. And I guess the question is, how should people invest if there is going to be such a price decrease? That's the worry.
Well, I see and hello Japan and hello Matsuda, and I think it is a concern. And some of the people who are investing at the moment on a certain understanding of where renewable energy prices will go are repeating the mistake, the sort of the category error in a way that the fossil fuel industry has made. If you look at the forecasts that people in the coal and oil sectors have made when they project forward the demand for their products, be it coal or oil or shale or gas or whatever it is, it shows a fall. I should do it this way. It shows a fall, and then it shows things going back to a level that is predictable. And what they routinely fail to recognize is the price continues to go down. Now, that's a negative thing in the fossil fuels industry, because it means you can't invest in the future. But if renewables players in the renewable energy get this right, then they'll follow the same sort of trajectories that the new economy and some of those digital pioneers followed, where things do get, I mean, you think about the computers that we're all doing this event and discussion on, and you think what a piece of machinery like this would have cost 40 years ago. It would have been more than almost that you'd earn in a lifetime. So it's a challenge, and Japanese companies have been leaders. I remember having watches 30 years ago that had solar cells in them from different Japanese companies. But it's murder when markets start to behave in that way, where not only the actual price, but the expectation of future prices starts to go down that decline. It has to, though. It's absolutely necessary it happens, and I think as a result, probably not inevitably, it's going to happen. So sorry for the bad news, but it's out there and it's coming.
Yeah, these are great questions. So please keep them coming through, everybody. Another question from Japan, actually. What do you predict would happen between now and the end of 2050, given that many countries are now committing to CO2 net zero emissions?
Yeah, I don't know, honestly, because I'm not a utopian, and I don't believe that the entire world will go to a future where everyone is net zero and everyone lives in inclusive societies. You only have to look at places like Ethiopia or at the moment to know, and look back through history to know, that we are a pretty turbulent species. And there are consequences of that immediately through deaths right out to genocide, and also just long-term cultural dynamics which stand in the way of particular regions or countries or whatever doing what they really need to do to secure the futures of their populations. I don't think it's any accident at the moment that much of the really interesting leadership is coming through from cities. And the reason is that often I think that the consequences of some of these issues are much more obvious to mayors of cities and populations of cities who vote for the mayoral candidates. And it's also, they have more freedom of maneuver to try stuff out, to commit to things, to make things happen. So I think we will see a lot of, I mean, into the 2050s, a lot of experiments at different levels. They could be country level or regional level or city level or whatever, which a lot of them will fail. That is inevitable. But what I'm fascinated by is to see some of these failed industrial cities like Detroit starting to go now into some of the new technologies, and you see vertical farming sort of coming in into areas that were previously sort of domestic housing. In Pittsburgh, you've got or had, they probably still have a mayor, Bill Peduto, who's been basically, you may remember when Donald Trump went to Paris and said, or did he go to Paris? I'm not sure he did, but afterwards he said, you know, Pittsburgh doesn't need the Paris Climate Accord. And Bill Peduto said, that's exactly what we need, because that's our future, because we're going for solar and wind and artificial intelligence and robotics and so on. So I would love to believe that a rising tide would raise all boats. But I actually also think that the sustainability agenda, most people think of it as a peaceful change agenda. I spent half a day with the British Ministry of Defence 2 weeks ago, and with the general who's been charged with working out what it means for the British armed services and defence industry in the sort of next few decades to be in a world that is increasingly disrupted by climate change, by the climate emergency, and by growing numbers of people being forced to move from places that they have long lived, long farmed, and so on. And it's, at some levels, it's a terrifying prospect. It really is. On the other hand, I think our species tends to do its best and most effective work quite often when it's backed itself into a corner. And now here we've done it, and the corner is global. And it'll be very interesting to see in November next year what happens at the climate COP26 conference in Glasgow in Scotland. My own feeling is that it's going to go probably further than people currently expect, because I think now there is look at what's happening in Australia. Look what's just happened in California. Look at Brazil, where you have Bolsonaro, God help Brazilians, but you, at the same time, you've got the Pantanal, which is one of the world's largest wetlands. It accounts for 3% of the global stock of wetlands. 20% of the Pantanal has burned this year. The evidence is all around us, and I think people are awake to that increasingly. They just don't know what to do, and that's why I think leadership is now critical, and that's why I think by 2030, whether or not we've delivered the Sustainable Development Goals, we will be run by a class of leaders, many of them from Harvard, I'm sure, but who are categorically different. And I give you one final example: Greta Thunberg, a 15-year-old child going to the United Nations, going to the World Economic Forum, and telling those idiotic leaders what they should be doing with the world. I mean, how extraordinary is that? And I just think that's the beginning of a process, not the end.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a little intemperate, but it was
that is very, very, very inspiring. And I guess the question is that it's very difficult to answer now, whether we're going to see who's going to be mostly affected. Is it going to be once again poor parts of the society that are going to be left behind? And how, if that's the case, how regulators, politicians, and companies are going to try and address that so that we actually do see a change that is more towards a direction that we all want to see towards a more sustainable living. And I guess the last question, because we're running out of time, comes from Lauren Jones, and it's about higher taxation. And the question is whether you are in favor of higher taxation of the wealthy in order to protect the most vulnerable from these economic rabbits, where global taxes, Piketty recommends, to address global poverty is the way forward.
Simple answer is yes, I'm in favor of higher taxation of the wealthy. I think it has to be done very carefully, because if one country does it, it just simply drives the wealthy elsewhere. But I think there's a big correction needed in terms of wealth distribution. And I think the wealth divides that have sprung up in different countries around the world in the last 20 or 30 years are deadly dangerous. I think we've got to begin to address that sensibly. Let me just say, I've just been tracking the questions and responses in the chat. If people feel that they would like to have had a go at me and ask a rude question or an energetic question or whatever sort of question, or make a comment, my email is john@volans.com, and I answer every email.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I would actually urge everyone who joined today to go ahead and read the book. It is very inspiring. I'm a journalist. Joe works in the corporate world, and we both found it very interesting from like different angles and different perspectives. So no matter what industry you're in, I think it lays the foundation for what is to come next, and as John said, in the next decades. Yes, please.
Sorry to do this, but I noticed in the chat somebody's asking about how do they get the discount. You might want to address that separately or whatever. But just thank you very much for the plug for Green Swans. I appreciate that immensely. But the book that I'm reading at the moment is a science fiction book by an author who some of you will know of, Kim Stanley Robinson. And the title of the book is New York 2140. If you have a moment, it's a huge book, but it's an incredibly readable book. It pictures a New York that's largely underwater, but it's absolutely fascinating. And when we're thinking about what the future holds in this sort of area of climate shock and all the rest of it, we tend to sort of think from where we are outwards. And it's not a bad thing every so often to think from the future where that might take us backwards. And one of the things I've found is many business leaders are now starting to read science fiction again, because they see this as a really interesting challenge to their mental models and thinking. So I didn't mean to crash in, but I really would recommend that book, and the discount I'm sure will be available to anyone who wants it.
I've written down the title, so as soon as we finish, I'm going to go ahead and order the book, and I'll send you my thoughts once I finish it.
Thank you.
So for the discount, please send an email to me directly. You can find my email on the invitation, or to Verity, or through the club. Whoever you email, we will get back to you, and we'll be able to let you know how you can get the discount. John, thank you so much for such an inspiring talk. We're going to upload today's event on our YouTube link. We're creating a YouTube link where we can gather all our events online, and we're going to share it with every one of you. We're going to come back in the new year with more events. We've already lined up some speakers we're going to announce in the next couple of weeks, so watch this space. Thank you so much to Joe Whiteman and to Erica Susanto for helping put this event together. And yeah, of course, to all of you for joining us. And once again, to John Elkington and his great work to date, a very, very inspiring discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you all.